Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Securing Lift and Shift Cloud Migrations, sponsored by CloudPassage. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackleford, SANS Analyst, Instructor, and Course Author, and Carson Sweet, Co-founder and CEO for CloudPassage. He will be moderating today's webcast. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Fantastic, and thanks, Carol. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Really excited to be here with Carson. My name's Dave Shackleford, and some of you might have heard my voice before, probably from a SANS class or something else. I'm doing a lot of talking about cloud these days, and Carson's been talking about it, I think, even longer than I have. So it's always good to get together and have some conversations about what's going on out there and what kinds of things are really shifting in the landscape of cloud. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off, because I think, you know, the whole idea that, people are moving to the cloud more progressively than ever is sort of a given, right? I think we sort of saw that shift starting to happen a couple of years ago. But there's been some definitive sort of changes to that. So number one, people are moving more critical assets into the cloud. I think a lot of people sort of, dipped their toe in the water, as it were, and said, well, let's go find out what this thing is about. Is it going to stick, as it were? And I've had some great conversations with people in the industry that, really took their time getting to the cloud. But here it is, it's 2020, and most organizations have some cloud presence, and more than ever have critical assets and workloads running in the cloud. Now, there's a million questions that go along with that move. So when you start saying, as an organization, and you get the buy-in from stakeholders to start moving critical assets and critical types of data into the cloud, what are we going to do to make sure that's protected adequately? There's a lot of differences between traditional on-premise security and controls frameworks and technology stacks and those that are present within cloud environments. And although a lot of organizations, I think, have started to, sort of feel this out and get a sense for exactly what changes and what needs to change as they're moving into the cloud, truthfully, I still find that there's a lot of ambiguity and maybe a lot of uncertainty on certain parts of this, right? So having a strategy is critical. Obviously what you don't want is a scenario where you just start picking up and sort of moving things off into the cloud without really knowing exactly what it is you're doing. And so one of the things that I think both Carson and I are really wanting to make sure of in this webcast is to talk through those things and really make sure that they're clearly articulated, because the more you're moving into the cloud, and certainly the more sensitive assets that you're moving to the cloud, what you don't want to do is find yourself in a position where you're surprised about what controls are there, how those controls actually, sort of work, what the cloud provider is actually going to be responsible for. All those things are really important as we start making these moves. And the topic of today in particular is not so much about just going and, starting to flip switches and tune knobs in the cloud without any sort of ties back to the traditional on-prem infrastructure. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of that. It's the idea of, well, we're going to take things that we have been running and we're going to move those into the cloud. We're going to actually adapt those workloads, those assets, and bring them along for the ride because, well, we're progressively moving to cloud, and we're trying to sort of tilt the balance of where our assets are running and how they're operating from that traditional data center infrastructure model to a software-defined infrastructure that is present within any of the major cloud providers. So that's the big change that we're going to be talking about today, is actually taking stuff that we've been running and moving it. Now, that said, that's the question, right? What is lift and shift? And you hear this term, and I've actually had some great and sort of funny conversations with especially some of the students in my SANS classes. And I teach lots of classes on cloud and have been for some years now. And what I found in those dialogues with a lot of my students, mostly that come from enterprise organizations that are trying to figure all this out, is that there's this real hesitance, or has been this hesitance, to do a lift and shift operation, because I think number one, organizations are just leery of things breaking. I mean, let's just get it out there. When you take something that, ran in one form factor, whether physical or virtual or both, and you move it out into something in Azure or Amazon or Google Cloud or somewhere like that, there's this, notion that, well, maybe it just won't work there. So I think that's been, something that people have been concerned with in the past. This notion of rehosting, taking something, moving it out into the cloud, and sort of changing how it operates. Well, what does that look like? And really, what are the technological impacts of that going to be? But, at the same time, I think there's been this other sort of lingering concern on, how do we make sure that it fits into that new ecosystem and that we're able to take these, kind of traditional security controls that we've told our auditors about and everybody has signed off on over the years and make sure that we don't really screw that up as well. So I'm going to go over to Carson. I'm going to ask you, because you're talking to people about this all the time, people that are, finally starting to feel that this is the time to make this move, this rehosting move. What's going on with that, right? We hear about all this new shiny cloud technology and people are starting to feel comfortable with the idea, but, what are you seeing your customers actually doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So why not just dive into the advanced technology? And there are a few reasons for it. The first is that a lot of companies, they're just not ready to refactor applications as they sit in the data center into, a serverless architecture, containerized architecture, or something like that. But they do want to try to get some of the cost benefits, the flexibility. They would love to reduce their data center footprint. And waiting to the point where you're completely refactoring, going all the way 100%, from the word go, that could be a pretty long wait, for sure. So I think a lot of the drive to lift and shift is to get started in the cloud. I think that's also a relatively lower risk entry into a public cloud environment, because again, you're not really refactoring anything, you're moving things as they are. Doesn't mean it's risk-free by any stretch of the imagination. But it's certainly much lower risk than completely refactoring an application. And the interesting thing about lift and shift that when we talk to companies, and they sort of, the things that blindside them is that I think there's this sort of natural initial thought process that we're moving to the cloud. So there is going to be an account and a cloud provider, and it's going to be sort of one place to another place. But what actually happens is these servers, in many cases, it's more like a diaspora. They may end up in multiple accounts. If these are applications that are really owned by business units, they may want to use different cloud providers for various business reasons. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is this is not a one place to one other place move in many cases. The other reason for having multiple cloud accounts when you're doing lift and shift is actually a security practice that, Dave, I know you teach about, blast radius. So you want to minimize blast radius, and what that ends up looking like in many cases is one cloud account per application. So it is quite a bit different than people may think it is on the surface. The other interesting thing that's happened recently is we have seen sort of an acceleration in wanting to move to public cloud because of COVID. People don't want to go to data centers. They don't want to have to be physically interacting with systems. So this idea of just replatforming existing servers to a public cloud environment where the physical environment is irrelevant at that point, it's something that's accelerated the pace for sure, Dave.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that exact thing that you spoke of, is this sort of accelerated move with COVID, the realization that look, everybody's already out of here. Why go back, at least with some of it, right? And so there's been kind of an interesting transition happening there. I think even more almost philosophically as much as sort of tactically. So the idea of lift and shift has been growing for some time. It's going to continue to grow, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own challenges. And so we've seen this, certainly, again, over the past couple of years, as more organizations have started down this road to take on-premise assets and move them out, and to do so without massive refactoring or sort of remodeling of their application infrastructure as well. Because now you've got new pieces, right? You have new pieces of the equation. Number one being, I think, the cloud control plane, which a lot of people, I don't want to say take for granted, but I think they don't realize the breadth of what that represents. And certainly there's a lot of cases where it's just, easy to misconfigure or easy to miss a particular best practice configuration, or potentially set things up in a way that seems perfectly rational without necessarily realizing that a lot of the interconnectedness of various cloud fabric services and components ties back to things in ways that we didn't understand before. So that's been a big one for sure. I think just the nature of everything being software defined has been a challenge, especially in that lift and shift model, because now you're taking things that might have been plugged into traditional, sort of blinking things in racks in an on-premise scenario, and there are no things blinking in racks, at least not that we're dealing with. So software-defined networking, software-defined storage, compute, all those things are really, to some degree, a whole new frontier for organizations. I think we've also seen the significant acceleration of identity and access management in just how everything is plugged together, right? I sort of refer to this as the glue of cloud, truthfully, because everything is an object, everything associates or orients towards other objects and assets in the cloud, even in a lift and shift model. And on an on-premise scenario, you really haven't had to think about, say, like an SAP deployment or something in the context of all of those sort of roles and privileges that you do within a cloud environment. So back to those big questions. Are the security controls out there portable? Can we take things that worked on-prem and just bring them right out into the cloud and check the box and say, okay? And the other thing too, and this has been a much bigger conversation that people have sort of been forced to address, is what does the perimeter even look like? And that's been an ongoing battle in the security industry and really just in the IT industry for the past, well over a decade. But in the cloud, the notion of perimeter has definitely started to change again due to everything being software-based and the fabric that people are starting to build things on.
Yeah, and Dave, I'll just toss in another thought here, with the challenges not specifically related to lift and shift, but that comes soon after, because people often we see people blindsided again with this idea that we're just moving servers, nothing really changes. But the ops teams, particularly if you start to see your ops teams break up and turn into DevOps teams, when they get into these cloud environments and they start to figure out what they can do, the ball starts to roll downhill really, really fast. So it's good to understand the next set of challenges, and the big one that's coming next is really speed. We talk to companies that are working on these things in turn. We sort of like mnemonics. We use the 3Ds. These environments are very dynamic. They change very frequently, very fast. They're, as you mentioned here, they're very diverse. There's a lot more types of things that you have to protect. Excuse me, and they're distributed. Those are the 3Ds that challenge security from what it's traditionally done. But the speed of change, to the point of your discussion about software-defined networking controls, that's going to result in speed. And so one of the challenges, with that comes soon after basic lift and shift is when the snowball starts to roll downhill. The environments grow very quickly and they move very fast. So the ability to keep up with that. How are you going to keep up with that growth? Because what you're lifting and shifting today is the tip of the iceberg. That's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, this really is only the beginning. Just getting things moved into the cloud in some form factor or another is really where a lot of the additional work begins. And to that point, one of the other major things that I think people have started to realize is that once you're in a cloud provider environment, yeah, you're dealing with a third party. You're dealing with a third party infrastructure. And as such, there's a sort of, change in who's responsible for managing and maintaining aspects of the security that previously were wholly under your control. And in fact, this is one of the things I talk about often when I teach classes on cloud and cloud security. And I sort of feel that here it is, again, we're in 2020. The concept of the shared responsibility model is not new. And so I always tell people, look, I know you've probably heard of this and that this is something that you might have come across in your travels as a security professional. Certainly today, that's not uncommon. But I'll be the first to admit, I actually made a mistake in making the assumption that everyone understood this. In fact, I even give an example of this. A few years ago, I was on premises with one of my clients. And in fact, we were having a meeting about some cloud strategy and some shifts of things into the cloud, in fact. And it wasn't a technology professional. It was an executive that was sitting across the table from me, a director of a business unit. And he made some comment to the effect of, and I'll paraphrase here, we don't have to worry about that because the provider is going to take care of it. And it was something like anti-malware technology or something that they had been struggling with, for years and years on premise. And it had just been this foregone conclusion that, it was going to be a struggle forever. And for whatever reason, this particular individual, and maybe perhaps the team that worked with and for this individual, felt that, hey, that's not going to be a problem anymore. And they were feeling as though this was going to be this major benefit. We're moving out to the cloud. We don't have to worry about this, pesky, situation that we have been in forever. And it was that moment. That was the light bulb moment for me where I realized it's a bad assumption to make that everyone understands, at a deep level, exactly what that shared responsibility means and in what contexts. And so today, I think the major cloud providers have worked pretty hard to try to articulate this and try to sort of get it out into the community and say, hey, look, you really do need to understand this stuff, right? I think that's something that's important. But my perception here, the single biggest challenge to some of the cloud customers out there that are engaging in this shared responsibility model is at what levels and in which service models your responsibilities are changing, either subtly or dramatically. And I think there's a lot of gray area here that people just go in maybe a little bit blindly or completely blindly, not understanding. And you don't want this to come back and bite you.
Yeah, I think, Dave, that, one other point to touch on here is that this is going to be different across different cloud providers. So the rough lines that you see on the screen here, they're about right. But as you go from cloud provider to cloud provider, which will happen, that's the thing for the security team to keep in mind. Once they understand this model, it will differ. So you think of this as an SLA, if you will. What services are being provided, for IS services versus PaaS services, and what does the customer, in this case our listeners, what do they have to pick up? Again, the little differences can mean a lot. So really understanding that on a per provider basis is really important. The good news there is it doesn't change from account to account. This isn't something that's really negotiated. It is what it is. So if you understand it for AWS, you understand it for all of AWS. If you understand it for Google, you understand it for all of Google. But keep in mind that they do differ across cloud providers.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. I mean, while there are some similarities, they're not the same. So yeah, GCP is different from Azure, which is different from AWS, and so on and so on. And so, thematically, sure, it makes sense, but you do need to be looking at those nuances. And I think the other thing too is to sort of start thinking about how you take that concept of the shared responsibility model and start adapting that into the cloud scenarios that you're actually using and you're building. And so what that usually means is, and this is a question that comes up, by the way, all the time, not only in courses I'm teaching, but with clients of mine consulting, just people I'm talking to in the industry, there's just this constant banter of, what are the things that stay somewhat the same? What are the things that just don't make any sense anymore? And what are some of the sort of subtle shifts that might really just be bringing concepts we're familiar with and changing sort of tactically what they look like? And so you start looking at the tooling of security in these cloud environments, and you start realizing that for just about every use case, you're going to need to change at least some things. And so number one, you're going to start looking at products and solutions that are a bit more cloud oriented and cloud friendly. And they have not always been that way. And I think we've seen this progressively over the years. A lot of the traditional sort of agent-based solutions of the world, and we all know those, we've all, sort of wrangled some of those in our lives and careers, have not always been quick to adapt in bringing that same mindset out, into the cloud where, let's face it, every CPU tick, every little bit of memory that's consumed, it costs money. It's an immediately translatable thing. It's all processing cost, and processing cost is cost. So what you're looking to do naturally is minimize the footprint, not just for performance savings, but also that immediately translatable financial impact that comes about with that. So I think number one, that's a big factor. Looking for cloud-friendly agents that are super lightweight. Number two, agentless options, because now you've got this massive software ecosystem. And since everything is fundamentally plugged in one way or another to the fabric of the providers themselves, you have a lot of APIs to hook into. And once again, a lot of solutions just weren't quick to, sort of start taking that route and really make sure that APIs were, sort of something that they were tapping into. Automation is a huge part of this. And especially in lift and shift models and mindsets, I think that this is something people are cautious about. You don't want to automate yourself off a cliff, as it were. And I think there's this hesitance in taking traditional workloads or, application stacks, bringing them out into the cloud, and then starting to, sort of dovetail those and adapt them and tie them into some of the automation capabilities that we really do now have and should be using in the environment. But my thought on this pretty simply is you're never going to get there in cloud security without at least some automation. And you can choose to what degree that looks like, but trying to maintain, sort of manual, slow, static types of processes and capabilities just doesn't really work well. And then, naturally, especially if you move into more than one cloud, you really need to be thinking about this notion of ease of deployment and ease of management more than ever. Now, that's sort of a Captain Obvious moment, in my opinion. I mean, nobody is looking for a difficult product to deploy and manage, of course, but I think people take it for granted. I can figure this one out and so on. But as soon as you start stepping from one cloud to the next and you're trying to bring some of the same concepts and controls with you along the way, that starts to matter more than ever, because you don't want to duplicate effort or sort of multiply the amount of time needed to deploy and manage any of the solutions that you're planning on deploying in the cloud for security purposes.
Yeah, and Dave, one comment here, you mentioned about automating off a cliff and so forth. We do occasionally get people that are worried about, we don't want automation because we don't want to reduce our headcount. There has never been in 10 years of doing this, cloud security, CloudPassage has been around for a long time. We've never seen a headcount go away. There is no lack of other work to do for sure. The goal here is to take the grunt work and make it go away, but it's also realizing that there's a new level of workflow. So it's not that you're trying to make what's there more efficient as much as you're trying to keep up with the new rate of change that happens in these environments. So that's really important to understand, that the goal here is to augment your staff, not to try to reduce them. And again, we've never seen hundreds of deployments. We've never seen anybody reduce headcount. The other thing I'll point out is being integrated with the cloud environment and being automated. That's not just the agents, and for sure the agents, the API connectors, things, those are important, but also remember the licensing and deployment of the actual product itself. We do see a lot of products out there where you have to, instead of a product that automatically deploys, there's no licensing steps that are involved. There are products out there that say that they're cloud products. One of the tenets of a cloud product is you don't have to call anybody, you don't have to manually take steps to deploy it. But with these products, they do, and they tend to be the legacy products. So if you've got a product that you're taking to your ops teams, you're saying this is going to be fully automated, it's not going to slow you down, but then the first time you have to do, a cloud burst or an auto scaling event, you have to go to the licensing website of this vendor and request more licenses or shift licenses, and there's a manual process. It's already broken. So keep in mind, it's the licensing, it's operational processes. All of that has got to be completely automatic. Those are things that get lost and they turn into very, very high friction situations in cloud environments.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up licensing. and it's funny because it's one of these sort of background noise things that we're all dealing with and living with in our lives. But I mean, certainly I can speak over the course of my career, just managing some products out there where the licensing and the license management alone is like a full-time job. You've got to have people that are wholly responsible for just keeping up with these incredibly complex licensing schemes. And to your point, that just needs to go away. We really need much more seamless and automatable licensing accommodation, especially as cloud environments are too dynamic to have it any other way. All right, so moving on and sort of speaking to the next major thing that we really need to be considerate of as we're planning a lift and shift model going into cloud, we really need to be thinking about the sort of attack surface and really what's going to be, the list of assets that need to be protected in the first place. And there's a lot of things to talk about here. In fact, this could be, we could consider this really like a cloud architecture light conversation in many ways. And as Carson mentioned just a minute ago, I think the theme of limiting and minimizing the blast radius has bubbled to the surface and really been something we've taken hold of over the last couple of years. And that's across the board. That's not just for lift and shift scenarios. It's really, all encompassing, because you do expect that failure conditions will happen. And this doesn't necessarily mean you were attacked. It might simply be a change that was made that had an unforeseeable impact, or somebody accidentally went in to tinker with something and had, sort of ramifications they didn't anticipate. But it certainly does represent a attackable surface where potentially something gets compromised, something gets attacked. And what you're looking to do is minimize the sort of lateral movement or the ripple effects that could then ensue as a result of that occurring. So security strategy for the cloud definitely needs to take into account some of the newer technical considerations here. And as I referenced before, that's going to be things like the control plane. In fact, if I recall correctly, I just finished checking out a few months ago, and I'm sure many of you did as well, the most recent Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that was published. And I'm always a fan of those guys' work. I think they do a nice job just, sort of crunching the data and the numbers. And there was a significant, I think it was over 20% of the incidents that they reviewed for this current report included cloud. And in fact, the number one issue cited in relation to cloud in these sort of incidents and or breaches were issues in configuration related to the control plane. So people are making mistakes, or they're implementing things in ways that they probably don't fully understand. And personally, I expect that trend to continue without some serious work to try to get it under control. Number two, it's API interfaces. And so API interfaces are something that the attackers have most definitely discovered. And once again, we've got a plethora of examples of this occurring over the past 2 to 3 years, where really there's been this surge in, number one, just moving to cloud, but number two, the types of APIs showing up and being used and leveraged by organizations has dramatically increased. And the one that always stands out to me, I mean, there's tons of these examples out there, but the one that always stands out to me in particular was actually from 2 years ago. It was in 2018, where there was some research done looking for open Kubernetes APIs that were exposed on the internet. And it turns out that a bunch of them were A, exposed, and B, almost wholly and completely unprotected. So, you found that a bunch of the attackers of the world had discovered these, used it to, use these Kubernetes control consoles to deploy containers and spin up things to do cryptocurrency mining and so forth. And in fact, I think it was Tesla that was sort of the high profile name that had in fact been a victim of this and had that occur to them just because they hadn't protected some of those APIs. The use of privileges, as I mentioned, it's the glue that holds everything together. You've got a lot of new service types of accounts. You've got a lot of new pieces and parts that are going on there. And you look at, for instance, running workloads in a place like AWS, where very often an instance profile or a role or privilege set has been assigned to those workloads, allowing them to align with or communicate with other services within that cloud fabric. And those have been abused heavily. But if you really go out and look at a lot of the security tools and practices from the past, they are completely blind to any of those scenarios and those types of attacks. So you have a lot of these new things cropping up that just need to be addressed and considered as you're making these moves into cloud. But in addition to that, you need to look at the operational model. So are we just going to build one big cloud data center, or are we going to try to limit the blast radius, as Carson said a moment ago, and split things out into things like different accounts or different subscriptions? Are we going to try to maintain our traditional change management processes and practices and configuration management practices to go along with that, or shift towards more of a dynamic model? So looking at more of a DevOps type approach, where you have a pipeline that's either, semi-automated or wholly automated in your deployments. And so what I tend to find, especially with people moving into a lift and shift model, is that very rarely is all of this sort of put on the table and considered before they start making those moves. And that could be a big mistake, right? You obviously want to make sure you're thinking about this stuff ideally before it comes back to bite you down the road. Now, this is where we start thinking about the unification of controls. And so I think we've sort of laid out the, let's call it the problem statement, as it were. There's a lot of moving parts. There are certainly some differences in the way that the cloud providers operate and what that shared responsibility model constitutes. But when we go back and take inventory or stock of the types of controls that we've relied upon, I always actually tell my students this too. I say, look, you'd actually be doing yourself a very big favor by going back and taking a look at your existing controls that you have been reliant on, and then mapping those out and saying which ones work, which ones don't, and which ones could we, maybe even completely just do away with because we have new models of performing those controls and enacting those controls within cloud environments. And so ideally, what you're looking for here is not only the opportunity to find the best controls to suit the environment you're operating in, but you're looking to consolidate some of these things. I think Carson just kind of alluded to this. You really don't want to get into a disjointed situation where you're doubling or tripling or quadrupling your effort because you're trying to implement one control in one environment, another control in another environment. You're still trying to maintain on-premise stuff that really just doesn't adapt well to cloud. And even though, again, you only have so many people in the organization, you can find their time getting chewed up very, very rapidly, even with some of the automation that we touched on just a moment ago. And so one of the themes that I've always really, kind of looked to get across to a lot of my students is this concept of centralization and unification. Wherever possible, especially if you're in multi-cloud. I mean, the minute you move into more than one cloud environment, your troubles can get exponentially worse if you're not keeping this theme in mind. You're looking for tools that allow you to build out things like asset inventory. And the good news is with APIs across the cloud provider environments, I firmly believe this is easier to do than it ever has been. I think this is one of the places where, in fact, we might have some better opportunities in cloud than we've ever really had on premise. But you have to know how to take advantage of those. And then you're looking for more of the traditional practices and capabilities across things like vulnerability management, threat and compromise detection. You're looking for change and configuration management and shifts and drifts of those configurations. Now, look, everything in the cloud tends to be more dynamic. And so you're not going to have, let's say, hopefully not going to have systems that are being spun up and living for, 3 to 5 years. Now, in a lift and shift model, that's usually where we're coming from. Let's be honest. I mean, a lot of these systems that we're considering critical that we're bringing along into the cloud have probably been systems that we've been running for some time previous to this. And I think it's a bad idea to think, well, we'll just take that exact same approach. You're lifting and shifting, but that doesn't mean that you're going to run that workload for 5 years like you have on premise. Nonetheless, we still need to be very cognizant of the concepts of hardening, survivability, making sure that we're doing, sort of stringent change monitoring, and ensuring that all of those tools are as centralized as we can get them. And they also kind of align with that notion of automation. So it's not as though you necessarily need to automate every single piece of this, but you're certainly going to have some degree of automation here, not only for deployment, but for maintenance of those systems and those controls over time. Because you'll find too that, especially if you're in multiple accounts, you're in multiple subscriptions, you're in multiple providers, you tend to have this sort of sprawl that occurs in the cloud. And that might not be just the lift and shift pieces, but it might be related components or other things that you're using in conjunction with those. And the more assets you have, I don't think anybody needs me to tell you this, but the harder it is to manage all that without that, sort of unification in place.
Yeah, and Dave, one thing we're seeing as well, and I know you and I have talked about this, is again with COVID and the personnel impact to a lot of companies. A lot of companies out there are having, furloughs. The security teams are getting targeted for these things. We've got customers and prospects that we're working with that their security teams have been retasked to do IT support and DevOps and things like that. The need to unify is even more important now. that's something that we've seen a big trend in since COVID sort of took over the economy and the operating world. That's been a very, very big deal. Less individual tools, less point solutions, more consolidation, and still at the same time, still more automation of more things. That's been a big driver since COVID broke out as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think actually that's a pretty good segue to the next sort of set of questions or pieces here, because truthfully, pre-COVID, if I had been talking about a lift and shift strategy, I would have really extolled this. I would have said, hey guys, you've already got this on-premise environment, you've sort of got a staging scenario for migration as you've been moving to cloud progressively. What you ideally want to do for a lift and shift is use that environment to the best degree possible and ensure that you are building out the sort of cleanest migration strategy possible, right? In other words, how are you going to develop your system build? Let's do that behind the closed doors of the data center, as it were, or, what are the test cases we're going to put in place for those lift and shift systems moving into the control plane. But I think given the sort of rapid onset of completely remote work and, especially with everybody being away from data centers and being away from traditional business environments, some of that seems to be changing. I'm curious, Carson, have you seen that as well? Are people actually moving more towards some of the, development of system builds and other things in cloud now that the circumstances have changed a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes a lot from the fact that these aren't physical servers in a data center. They're not even, traditional virtual machines in a data center that tend to be, a little bit less quick and easy to spin up and spin down. The ability to automate, write scripts that builds, what we hear termed in most cases, I'm sure a lot of the folks on the call are familiar with this concept, bakeries, a bakery model for, virtual machines that build it up, from the ground up. This is the basis for containers, very similar software defined sort of process. So the ease of doing that in a public cloud environment is a natural, it removes kind of some natural obstructions to doing this level of automation and building these bakery models. Absolutely a huge use case that we see in play at some of the more advanced customers. Another, point here is, Jenkins and CI/CD orchestrators are not just for containers. We do have a lot of customers who are leveraging, the shift left model for AMIs and Amazon, so that when they launch those EC2 instances, they know they're clean, and they build them just like they build code. Because at this point, in infrastructure as a service environment, those servers, those EC2 instances, those Azure compute instances, those are just more code. So yeah, we absolutely do see that.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a trend that's not going to revert. I think you're going to see a lot more of sort of in cloud build out, in cloud pipeline and streamlining for every manner of workload, whether that's serverless, whether that's containers, whether that's traditional types of instances and things. And to the same point, because people are going to be doing that, people are going to be relying more on the cloud infrastructure itself or themselves for pretty much everything operational. It's naturally going to start speaking to the presence of those APIs that we referenced a minute ago. Now, the key for this, though, is looking at your security platforms as well. So your security platform needs to be accommodating of the cloud infrastructure and the software-defined environment, just like anything else that you would be using, like a Jenkins orchestrator or anything else like that. You need to make sure that your APIs with your security platform are both bidirectional and robust, meaning that they're flexible and capable of being integrated in more ways than one, right? You don't want rigid platforms that aren't capable of growing with you and how you're planning on building out your cloud environment. And the key thing here is to really ensure that this sort of scenario that we're talking about here, this lift and shift model where you're moving infrastructure out into a cloud environment and you're not very likely to bring it back, that you're looking at solutions that give you better programmatic data access and control, right? In other words, you're tied into APIs from not only the provider, but your security solutions have APIs too, because you're going to be looking for new ways to streamline and automate some of your workflows and some of your playbooks for a number of different security organizations, whether that's the response team, whether that's the SOC, whether that's the organization tasked with just ensuring the security of hosts and systems is intact and meets organizational standards and compliance requirements, all of the above. Everyone needs to be able to tap into this concept of automation, especially as the use of cloud progresses. Now, that also means that in order to get this accomplished, you're going to be at some point presented with this idea, and it usually happens sooner rather than later in my experience, of, where do I best make use of the cloud provider's native technologies, and where do I best make use of third-party solutions and technologies as well? And what I have found personally, working with a lot of enterprise organizations and just, again, speaking with students and other folks in the industry, is that it's dependent to some degree on what it is you're building and how you're doing so. But for most enterprises, certainly those that have compliance requirements, and that's, let's face it, just about all of us, you're probably going to need some additional pieces to bring into the cloud environments above and beyond what they provide to you natively. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that you don't want to take advantage of those. So sure, you're going to want to use things like security groups in AWS. Sure, you're probably going to want to set up things like CloudTrail logging for the control plane, et cetera, et cetera. Those just make sense because they tie to the nature of the cloud environment themselves. However, if you're talking about lift and shift, you're talking about bringing workloads, you're talking about bringing things that had been reliant on a completely distinct set of controls on premise now out into the cloud. Well, what is that going to look like? And so what we have the opportunity to do now is say, okay, we might be doing a lift and shift today, but it's probably not going to stay that way, right? So you're going to take a lift and shift infrastructure and bring it out, but at some point you're going to want to start moving that lift and shift platform or set of platforms into a more cloud native usage scenario that's of course going to accommodate for things like containers, and certainly even breaking that apart into microservices architectures that might be taking advantage of serverless and similar types of cloud native technologies. It doesn't usually start that way. So it's not as though you have to take those traditional on-prem lift and shift types of tools and controls and everything else and immediately make them, sort of cutting edge DevSecOps sort of containerized types of strategies. But eventually you'll want to get there. And so the whole concept of thinking strategically means, look, position yourself to where when you start making those moves, when you start adapting your solutions and your application infrastructure to be a bit more cloud native, it's less lift and shift, and it's starting to take advantage of other storage options, other types of components and services in the environment. You're already positioned well with your security strategy, because you chose some solutions, again, some combination of things probably coming together as a control stack to help with that.
Yeah, and Dave, I'll kind of come back to the mnemonic that we like to use. If you really do sort of stick to that as a simple rule of thumb, that you need solutions that are strategically going to be able to handle environments that are diverse, distributed, and dynamic. That's important. You talked about today it's just servers, tomorrow it's going to be containers, no doubt, right? That's the diversity. When you get into serverless, where you're using DNS as a service, you're using database as a service, Docker runtime as a service, with Fargate, again, the diversity kind of explodes. So when you're looking at this, keep in mind that 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, probably sooner than that, the environment's going to meet those 3D, sort of attributes. So that's a simple way to keep it in mind. Are these solutions going to handle the diversity of the environments I'm going to have, the level of distribution, the number of places that assets are going to be in, and the speed and ease with which these environments can change.
Yeah, and I think that concept of the speed scares people a little bit because obviously when you start talking about the way cloud operates, it does move away from those sort of old school, sort of slow, lumbering change models that frankly it's a good time to be moving away from anyway. We should be embracing this, but naturally, especially with lift and shift, where it's usually critical infrastructure and assets and application stacks. It makes sense to be a little bit more strategic and cautious as you're making that move. And to that effect, I'll just say to sort of, summarize some of the things that Carson and I have been saying here. There are a couple key things that you really need to be keeping front of mind as you're making these moves out into the cloud. And I just can't stress it enough here. You need a central security control plane to the best degree possible. Having a highly distributed and sort of fractured security control plane is not really an advantage in any way. And I know, you're always saying, well, what kinds of tools do we need to get the job done? Today with cloud, there's just more opportunity to perform that centralization than ever before. Number two, compatibility, right? So you need things that work within the context of the cloud environments you plan on operating within. And to that point as well, better integration with those service environments, right? Compatibility with AWS APIs, with Microsoft APIs, with GCP APIs, and sort of deep foundation and how those environments operate. Those are all going to be really advantageous for that strategic mindset going forward. So Carson, take it away.
Sure. So, we wanted to just talk a little bit about how customers will leverage a platform. We're going to use our platform as an example. Just to orient you to our platform, we are a completely cloud-hosted SaaS, we're software as a service. These are kind of the headline environments that are supported. We have a very large range of customers, from a handful of servers to our largest customer has over 150,000 servers on a single deployment. So it's pretty broad range. But the key thing to touch on here again is you're looking for a platform that has a diverse set of capabilities. They can handle containers, they can handle servers, cloud, IaaS environments, CSPM if you're tracking the analyst, and it handles those the same way across a lot of different environments. So there are a lot of point solutions out there that you can piece together, but just to be very direct, who's got the time? Honestly, and the appetite to deal with that complexity. One thing I will point out is the API. Really important to have a complete API, meaning that anything you can do in the product's portal, you can also do in the API. That's what you want ideally, so that you're not stuck, dealing with the web-based portal. You can really build those automation flows when you get there. So, this is a very simple view of a public cloud environment. This particular one has got some ECS instances that are really just, what that means is they're EC2 instances with some special software to allow them to be, sort of specialized for running Docker runtimes. You got some generic EC2 server instances, and you got some serverless resources in this environment. This might be a few months after lift and shift, and people have decided, what, we're not really gonna do database operations in terms of running, a MySQL platform better than Amazon. So we're going to use their serverless database service. And then, we're going to start using S3 for object storage. So this is very simple, very straightforward. You see the control plane here. And this is really where we often see information security, really kind of hanging out and sometimes completely in the dark. And this is a very unfortunate situation, but it happens. One thing to remember, you start to see DevOps, pop up in your environment. This DevOps environment, they tend to live with the business units. So this is the challenge that we tend to walk into. What we tend to do and what we suggest, whether it's our platform or any other, the InfoSec team should, select a platform and then understand, okay, here's the shared responsibilities that I've got to deal with. I've got to deal with some issues based on, around the control plane itself, using, a CSPM type solution. And in the case of lift and shift, I'm going to have some servers. What often happens is when you start to get visibility in these cloud environments, you're going to find out pretty fast that there are container environments out there that you don't know about. But again, that's part of the benefit of a unified platform. Once the environment is set up, the introduction of it to the DevOps teams is probably around instrumenting, and again, these are going to be some API based points of instrumentation. Some will be traditional agents. We use micro agents that are about 2 meg in memory. But again, this is where DevOps, kind of gets introduced. And what happens is you don't try to get DevOps to dive in with both feet right out of the gate. You want to ease them into it, let them understand that, these sensors, these micro agents, these API connectors are not going to abuse their APIs. They're not going to abuse their servers and workloads. You start to get them comfortable. And once you have the environment instrumented, data starts to flow. We do not suggest that you immediately start dumping, issues and things that need to be fixed on DevOps. You're just gonna create a real backlash. But ease them into it. And the way to engage DevOps on these things is to have them introduce them to the API itself. So this is really, really critical, because DevOps teams don't want PDF reports that come out once a month or once a week. They don't want to get a giant Excel spreadsheet of things that need to be cleaned up a month before the audit. That's not how DevOps works. They want this information in their existing workflows. They want it in Jira. They want it in Slack. They want it in ServiceNow. Because again, the whole point of DevOps is to mechanize and really, make a factory assembly line model, for lack of a better analogy, so that everything is moving very, very quickly and there aren't one-offs. And so anything that interrupts that, just sort of creates a needle off the record moment, if you will. So that's really, really important, is to make sure you understand, the information you want to get to those DevOps teams, and that you can get it to them in a way they can use it quickly. Because I can tell you from experience, the days of them accepting the giant PDF out of a network security scanner, those days are gone. It just doesn't work in their operating model, and InfoSec is going to have to adapt. And once you do this, what you're going to find is these ops teams, in many cases, even for just standalone servers, if there are things that show up often, unpatched critical vulnerabilities, or badly configured S3 bucket, if they do start to move beyond server-based cloud infrastructure, they're going to start to automate remediation of these things. It is the DevOps way to automate anything that you're going to have to do more than once or twice. That is the way that DevOps works. That's a core tenet to DevOps, and they'll do it. And so what happens here is, by giving them access to the right data in the format that they work in every day, they're going to sort of instinctively or inherently start to automate, some of these remediation and threat response issues, and that makes them part of the solution. That brings you scale. That allows DevOps to become a force multiplier for security. The way this tends to look in deployment, just to give you a sense of what these solutions look like. For the cloud services, and again, some of these are server-based like EC2, but there are still control plane things that, need to be configured properly. There's some kind of an API connector, and this usually is not something you deploy in your cloud. It should be something that's in the solution, but it's connecting, and you've given it access typically to some sort of an auditor role or something like that. So the solution can see how all these, environments are configured. Cloud providers have something called cross-account role delegation. They have different names for it. That basically it allows one account to see into multiple cloud environments. And again, you will end up with multiple cloud environments. So these are pretty straightforward. We view this is the cloud secure solution in our world. These CSPM solutions are kind of like the Doppler radar. They're very broad. They show you everything that's out there, and they're very fast and quick to deploy. So this can be a really good way to get fast visibility. Deploying, server security, going deep into those servers. This is an example where there are multiple cloud accounts and a data center, right? So this is a very, very common situation with lift and shift. So when you get these slides, this is one to take a close look at and study. You've got some Red Hat web servers, some database servers. This looks like an application that someone's plugged in, to, let's say, AWS. Perhaps somebody's doing some, using Google Cloud Platform to do some MapReduce big data analysis with Hadoop. And they've got Zookeeper and maybe some other things out there to help run that. And then they've got the legacy data center. You're not going to pick up that Oracle 8i database, data warehouse, and move it to the cloud. It's going to be there for a long time. So the ability to address all of these in a single, pane of glass, a single solution, that portability, really, really important. And then for the container environments, I'm not going to dig deep on this. I'll just leave it for folks to take a look at. You can take a look at our website if you want to get more info on it. But container environments are there's quite a lot happening there, because there are servers, there are, some containers act as servers, some containers act as a microservice workload. You have the server component of Docker hosts, you have ECS, nodes. There's just a lot of different variations here. So for the sake of time, to make sure we can get some questions, I'm not going to, drill into this in a lot of detail. But the general progression here, if you move forward with this and you want to build a strategy, the first step is to focus on asset awareness. What's out there? What's it communicating with? How's it configured? And then understanding the survivability factor. Are these environments hardened? Will they survive the attacks that will come? And they will come. The next thing tends to be detecting new risks and threats. Have things drifted? Have things changed? As new assets get deployed in an environment, am I aware of them? Can I automatically determine what exposable, attackable surface areas are in those new systems? And then the next sort of big push tends to be, once the environment is protected, how do we make compliance easier? How do we not have the 1 month before an audit fire drill? And again, keeping in mind that in these cloud environments, just because an asset is ephemeral, it's up for a few hours or a few days, it's still in scope. So how are you going to deal with streamlining getting the data that you need from things that may have only been running for a few minutes or a few hours? And then finally, again, the automatic remediation. This is kind of the brass ring for most companies, and this is back to the point of enabling DevOps and making DevOps part of the equation, making them part of the solution, by delivering this actionable data to the system owners in a way that they work with it in their natural workflow. So they become a force multiplier for security, which really is what DevSecOps is all about. So that's sort of how we tend to see companies progress in a program like this. As far as where we're headed, we were going to do a quick demo, but we'll pass on that. Lots of public cloud services are in use within a large organization, and even some small organizations have multiple cloud providers and multiple services within them. There's going to be more cloud, not less. So this is coming. That's just like mainframes. Doesn't mean the data center goes away, just like mainframes never went completely away, but the growth is going to be in cloud. So this is something you've got to get ready for. And again, with moving these applications to the cloud, this is something that can make a ton of business sense, a ton of operational technical sense, but you as the security practitioners have to be able to give your enterprises the ability to be confident when they're adopting these strategies. So with that, I'm going to pop over to the Q&A real quick. There looked like a couple of questions came in, and we will answer a couple of those questions. Let me pop in here real fast. Let's see, we had just a comment here. Automation can significantly eliminate human error and tedious, repetitive tasks. Could not agree more on that one. So a question here, we have several teams moving workloads to the cloud. How should we engage with them, one at a time or all at once? Dave, do you want to take a swing at that one, and then I can add some perspective from our side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think let's be honest. I mean, every organization has their own politics and governance sort of hurdles that have to be accommodated for. So it's tough to give a uniform answer for everyone. But my general experience has been that it's probably best to tackle unique team scenarios on an independent basis. But that said, you need a little bit more holistic strategy for just what it's going to take to move things into the cloud. So it's a bit of a combination just in terms of having a strategy and approach and tooling and everything else. But each team will have their own specifics that probably need to be handled on more of a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, we see the same thing. These teams kind of, roll their own. One thing we do suggest is that companies pick one DevOps team, that's very security friendly, that get it, and start there and figure it out, and then use that as a template, and then you adjust. If you get the 80% done, then the 20 or 30% that's different from team to team tends to come along pretty nicely. Let's see, here's a good one. We're rolling out our first lift and shift. We got pulled in at the last minute. That never happens, right? What are the most important things to do quickly? From our perspective, the first thing would be really making sure you have visibility into those environments, so that clones of those servers and things that are starting to happen, you're aware they're out there to begin with. And the second immediate thing is the control plane configuration of the account itself, or the accounts, because those IAM controls, that is your new perimeter. And if those aren't configured well, people can drive a bus right through it. The third immediate thing would be to understand the vulnerabilities and exposures that exist on those systems that you may have been able to tolerate in the data center, where it was behind layers of perimeter security, but now it's not. Those would be the things that we would suggest. So we're at the top of the hour, so unfortunately we don't have time. We've got a couple other questions. We'll try to email folks with answers on those, but we are out of time at this point. So I'll turn it back over to you, Carol, and you can wrap us up.
All right, thank you so much, Dave and Carson, for your great presentation, and to CloudPassage for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.